Born in 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, Martin Luther King Jr. entered a world divided by color lines, a world where the simple act of sitting at the wrong lunch counter could lead to humiliation. Or worse. Yet even as a young boy, King carried something powerful within him, a quiet conviction that love, truth, and justice were stronger than hate. Growing up in the heart of the American South, Martin was no stranger to the sting of segregation. He saw his father, a Baptist minister, refuse to bow to injustice, and his mother teach him that dignity was not something anyone could take away. These lessons planted deep roots of moral courage in his heart. At just 15, Martin entered Morehouse College, a historically black institution that nurtured some of the greatest minds of his generation. Surrounded by mentors who believed in education as a tool for liberation, he began to question not only the world's unfairness, but also his own purpose within it. There, King discovered that leadership was not about commanding others, it was about serving a higher truth. His journey continued to Boston University, where he pursued a doctorate in theology. In those classrooms, he encountered the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi, the power of nonviolent resistance. To King, this was more than theory. It was a revelation. He began to see how love could be transformed into a weapon of moral strength, capable of disarming hate without shedding blood. When he returned to the South, America was on the brink of change. The winds of the civil rights movement were beginning to stir, and King was ready to answer the call, armed not with anger, but with faith, education, and an unshakable belief in justice. He stepped into history a young preacher with a dream that would soon shake the conscience of a nation. But this story is not just about the past. It is about courage, conviction, and the idea that even one voice, raised with compassion and purpose, can change the world. Martin Luther King Jr. did not just march for equality, he marched for the soul of humanity itself. If you believe that history still has lessons to teach us about love over hate, hope over fear, and unity over division, then stay with us. There is more to discover, more to feel, and more to remember. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter in this powerful journey through history. Together, let us keep the dream alive, not just in memory, but in action. When Martin Luther King Jr. returned from Boston, he carried with him more than a degree. He carried a philosophy that would redefine the course of American history. The ideas he encountered about nonviolence were not abstract lessons written in textbooks, they were living principles, deeply rooted in faith and humanity. Gandhi's vision of peaceful resistance had shown that oppression could be defeated not through anger or retribution, but through the courage to stand firm in love. To King, this was not just strategy. It was a spiritual calling. He believed that nonviolence was the truest expression of Christian love, a way to confront hatred without becoming consumed by it. In a world where cruelty often answered cruelty, his conviction was radical. The 1950s South was a land divided by laws and customs designed to remind black citizens of their place: segregated schools, restricted neighborhoods, and constant reminders that equality was still a distant dream. Many who suffered under these conditions felt anger rising in their hearts, and understandably so. Yet King urged a different path. He asked people to transform their pain into power, to channel their suffering into strength. He once said that darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. These words were not spoken for applause, they were a call to a higher way of living. King's belief in peaceful protest was soon tested. In 1955, the arrest of Rosa Parks in Montgomery became a spark that ignited the first great movement of his leadership. As buses rolled through the city nearly empty, the world watched with disbelief. For 381 days, black citizens of Montgomery walked miles to work, carpooled, and stood together in quiet defiance. Their unity, their discipline, and their refusal to respond to violence with violence revealed the power of nonviolent resistance. In its purest form, King, barely in his late 20s, became the face of a movement that was proving moral courage could shake the foundations of an unjust system. But the cost of such conviction was heavy. King's home was bombed, he was arrested, threatened, and often forced to stand in front of crowds that opposed him with fury. Yet even then, he refused to respond with hate. He preached that suffering for a just cause was not a sign of weakness, but of strength. Each act of restraint, each refusal to retaliate, built a moral contrast so striking that the conscience of the nation could no longer look away. Newspapers began to capture images of peaceful marchers attacked by police dogs and fire hoses. These images exposed the deep cruelty of segregation far more powerfully than words ever could. In these moments, King's philosophy showed its transformative power. Nonviolence was not passive acceptance. It was active resistance rooted in dignity. It demanded more courage than any weapon could provide. Standing unarmed before hatred required faith that truth and justice would ultimately prevail. King taught that love was not the absence of anger, but the mastery of it, a deliberate choice to answer injustice without surrendering to bitterness. His sermons echoed across churches and living rooms, reminding people that their struggle was not against individuals, but against systems of oppression that dehumanized both the oppressed and the oppressor. This moral clarity gave the movement its soul. It drew students, ministers, and ordinary citizens into a cause larger than themselves. Across the South, sit-ins, marches, and boycotts followed the same principle. Meet hatred with compassion, cruelty with composure, and injustice with persistence. The world began to take notice. Journalists traveled to cover the movement. Foreign nations admired its discipline. And young people found hope in the idea that dignity could be a weapon of liberation. Through all of this, King's voice became a moral compass for an anxious generation. His speeches carried the rhythm of the pulpit, but also the logic of a philosopher. He spoke of a beloved community, a society where peace and justice were not dreams but realities built through love. This vision was not naive idealism. It was a deliberate challenge to a divided nation. King understood that peace without justice was only the silence of submission. True peace required reconciliation, the healing of both heart and law. Even as violence threatened to drown the movement, King never abandoned his commitment to nonviolence. He reminded his followers that their protest was not merely for their own rights, but for the moral redemption of America itself. He envisioned a country where his children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It was this hope, so clear and human, that gave his message universal power. By turning the other cheek, King did not show weakness. He showed the world that moral strength could outlast physical force. His approach did not simply aim to change laws, it sought to change hearts. Through discipline, compassion, and unity, the oppressed reclaimed their humanity in a society that had long denied it. This transformation of spirit as much as of society became the cornerstone of his life's work. The legacy of this philosophy lives far beyond the marches and speeches. It endures in every peaceful protest, in every movement that seeks justice without hatred, and in every person who believes that change, though slow, begins with the courage to love when it is hardest. Martin Luther King Jr. proved that peace is not the absence of struggle, but the victory of conscience over fear. His dream was not merely for equality, but for the awakening of a nation's soul, a dream that continues to call to us, urging each generation to choose light over darkness and to walk forward, hand in toward freedom. The moment Rosa Parks refused to surrender her seat on a Montgomery bus in December 1955, history took an unexpected breath. It was a small act of quiet defiance, performed by a woman whose dignity spoke louder than any shout. Her arrest lit a spark in a city where injustice had long been accepted as routine, and it found fuel in the heart of a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. At the time, King was only 26, newly settled into his role at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He was not yet the world-renowned leader we remember, but his conviction was already unshakable. When community leaders gathered to discuss a response to Park's arrest, King's calm authority and moral clarity drew people toward him. Within days, the Montgomery Bus Boycott was born, an act of collective courage that would test the endurance and faith of an entire community. The plan was simple but daring. Every black citizen in Montgomery would refuse to ride the city's buses until segregation laws changed. For many, this meant walking miles to work, to school, to church, through rain or cold, past jeers and threats. But they walked anyway, not because they were certain of victory, but because they were tired of waiting for justice to arrive. What began as a one-day protest stretched into weeks, and then into months. In living rooms and church basements, people organized carpools, shared food, and prayed together. The boycott became more than a protest. It became a spiritual movement, an act of collective faith that ordinary citizens could hold power in their own hands. King's role quickly grew beyond the pulpit. He became the voice and face of the movement, speaking with a force that came not from anger but from conviction. His words were measured, his tone, but his message carried the weight of centuries of suffering. He reminded his followers that their struggle was not against individual bus drivers or city officials, but against a system built on moral wrong, standing before crowds that had every reason to despair. King spoke of love, unity, and the redemptive power of nonviolence. He told them that the boycott was not a war, but a test of moral strength, a chance to prove that the soul of a community could not be broken by hate. Yet the price of such defiance was heavy. King's home was bombed one night while his wife and baby daughter were inside. Miraculously, they survived. When an angry crowd gathered outside, ready to retaliate, King stood before them and pleaded for peace. His voice, steady and unwavering, carried through the chaos. "We must meet hate with love," he told them. "Remember, we are not seeking to defeat or humiliate the white man, but to win his friendship and understanding." Those words captured the essence of his leadership. He did not just organize marches or boycotts, he taught a way of being, a moral discipline that turned pain into strength. As months passed, the boycott gained attention beyond Alabama. Reporters from across the nation began to cover the story of the walking citizens of Montgomery, men and women who refused to surrender their dignity. The white establishment responded with arrests, intimidation, and legal challenges, but the movement held firm. Each act of oppression only revealed the cruelty of segregation to a wider audience. King was arrested, fined, and subjected to endless threats, yet his commitment never wavered. He continued to preach that nonviolence was not weakness, but power, the kind of power that transforms hearts as well as laws. The resilience of the people astonished the nation. Week after week, they gathered in churches to sing hymns and share testimonies. Their songs became prayers for endurance. Their unity became a symbol of hope. What had begun as a local protest was now a national awakening. Black Americans across the country looked to Montgomery and saw a new possibility that change could come not through despair or vengeance, but through faith and persistence. The moral contrast between peaceful protesters and the harshness of their oppressors became undeniable. Newspapers published photographs of wary yet determined faces, of women walking barefoot to work, of men offering rides to strangers just to keep the boycott alive. The movement's strength was not in its leaders alone, but in the collective courage of thousands who refused to bow. Finally, after 13 long months, The Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. The victory was more than legal. It was spiritual. It proved that justice could be achieved through peaceful means. That ordinary people united by a shared cause could bend the arc of history. When the decision was announced, joy swept through Montgomery. People wept, prayed, and embraced in the streets. Buses that had once been symbols of humiliation now became symbols of triumph. For King, this moment was transformative. He had entered the movement as a preacher with conviction and emerged as a national leader, a symbol of moral resistance. The success of the boycott showed the power of disciplined unity, but it also revealed something deeper: that love and nonviolence, when practiced collectively, could challenge even the most entrenched systems of injustice. The Montgomery victory gave birth to a wider movement that would soon spread across the American South. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and marches would follow, each guided by the same principles forged during those long, weary days of walking. But the Montgomery Bus Boycott was not merely the first step in a political struggle. It was a test of humanity's conscience. It asked a nation to look in the mirror and see the contradictions between its ideals and its realities. King's leadership gave that mirror a voice: steady, compassionate, and unflinching. The movement did not end with buses. It began there. From the streets of Montgomery rose a new vision of America, one built not on the strength of laws alone, but on the strength of love, unity, and moral courage. And though the road ahead would be long and filled with trials, King had already shown what was possible when people stood together in peace. The boycott's victory was not just the triumph of a city or a race, but the triumph of the human spirit, the undeniable proof that justice, though delayed, could never be denied when pursued with faith, discipline, and the unbreakable will to do what is right. The victory in Montgomery had proven that unity and nonviolence could move mountains. But for Martin Luther King Jr., it was only the beginning. The boycott had given him a national voice, and with it came the heavy realization that the struggle for equality extended far beyond one city's bus lines. Across the South, communities faced the same laws, the same intimidation, and the same desperate longing for justice. King knew that if real change was to come, the energy of Montgomery had to be transformed into a lasting movement, one that could bring together the moral power of the church and the organizing strength of the people. In 1957, that vision took form with the creation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Known simply as the Skulks, the organization was born out of faith and necessity. Ministers, community leaders, and activists from across the South gathered to discuss how they could turn scattered local efforts into a unified front. The church had always been more than a place of worship in black communities. It was a sanctuary of hope, a meeting ground, and a center of resilience. King and his colleagues saw in it the perfect foundation for a new kind of movement. The Skulk would not be a political machine but a moral force, dedicated to confronting injustice through nonviolence and spiritual conviction. It would coordinate protests, voter registration drives, and educational programs, all grounded in the belief that social transformation must begin in the heart. King's leadership was both visionary and deeply personal. He saw the church as a living symbol of the people's endurance, a reminder that faith could not be confined within four walls. As he traveled from city to city, from Birmingham to Albany, from Selma to Atlanta, his message remained clear. Freedom was not a gift to be granted, but a birthright to be claimed through courage and unity. He urged preachers to open their pulpits to truth, even when it invited danger, and he reminded congregations that faith without action was incomplete. To King, the gospel and justice were inseparable. To love one's neighbor meant to stand against systems that denied their humanity. The work of the Skulk was not easy. It required constant coordination, endless travel, and the ability to unite people who lived under the constant threat of violence. Meetings were often held in secret, their plans whispered behind closed doors. Volunteers risked their jobs, their homes, and sometimes their lives. Yet despite the fear that shadowed every step, there was also joy, a deep, unshakable sense that they were part of something sacred. The songs that rose from church gatherings were filled with longing and defiance, echoing across the night air like prayers carried to heaven. King's eloquence gave the movement its moral spine, but it was the courage of ordinary people that gave it life. Farmers, maids, students, and preachers stood side by side, linking arms in silent marches, facing down police batons and jeering crowds with nothing but their faith. The Skulk provided structure to this courage, helping communities organize boycotts and demonstrations that challenged the machinery of segregation. The strategy was simple yet profound: to expose injustice not with violence, but with truth, to confront cruelty not with hatred, but with steadfast love. As the Skulk gained influence, so too did the resistance against it. Opponents called King a troublemaker, accusing him of stirring unrest where there had been peace. But the peace they defended was the peace of submission, and King refused to accept it. He reminded America that true peace was not the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. When he spoke, his words seemed to pierce through the noise of hatred and reach the conscience of a nation. Even those who feared change could not ignore the calm authority in his voice, the certainty that his cause was righteous. The founding of the Skulk also marked a turning point in how the struggle for civil rights was perceived. It was no longer a series of isolated protests but a coordinated moral revolution. Each campaign built upon the last, weaving together the stories of countless unnamed heroes who dared to believe that faith could move history. King and his team developed workshops to teach the principles of nonviolence: how to remain calm when provoked, how to protect one another, how to turn suffering into strength. These teachings were not theoretical. They were lessons in survival. They equipped a generation of activists to face the brutal realities of segregation with dignity intact. The road was long, and setbacks were many. There were nights when exhaustion and despair pressed heavily upon King's shoulders. He wrestled with doubt, questioned whether love could truly overcome hatred so deeply rooted in society. Yet time and again, he found renewal in the same place where it all began, in faith. When the burden felt unbearable, he would return to prayer, to the quiet certainty that he was part of something greater than himself. The Skulk was not his alone. It belonged to the movement, to the countless souls who refused to be broken. By 1960, the organization had become a cornerstone of the civil rights movement, working alongside other groups like the NAP and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Together, they transformed the moral landscape of America. Every march, every speech, every act of defiance was a thread in the tapestry of a movement that reached beyond the South, beyond color, beyond creed. The Skulk embodied the belief that the church's role was not only to comfort the afflicted, but to confront the comfortable, to remind the world that justice was a sacred duty. Through the Skulk, King's philosophy found its most powerful expression. It gave ordinary believers a way to live their faith through action, and turned the ancient language of Scripture into a modern call for equality. From the pulpits of small rural churches to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the same message echoed: that love is stronger than hate, and that nonviolence is not submission, but the highest form of courage. In uniting the churches under one banner of purpose, King did more than organize protests. He awakened a nation's conscience. The Skulk became a vessel for transformation, proving that moral strength, when guided by faith and unity, could shake the very foundations of oppression. It was through this unity of spirit and purpose that King's dream began to take tangible form, not as a distant hope, but as a living movement, breathing life into the promise of freedom for all. By the summer of 1963, the struggle for civil rights had reached a point where hope and exhaustion walked hand in hand. Across the South, communities had endured arrests, beatings, and endless threats. Yet the movement's spirit refused to break. Martin Luther King Jr., now the undisputed moral leader of this vast crusade, knew that the time had come to take the message beyond the segregated towns of the South and into the very heart of the nation's capital. The country needed to see, to hear, and to feel the collective yearning for justice that had burned in the hearts of millions for far too long. Out of this conviction was born the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, a gathering that would unite ministers, workers, students, and dreamers under a single sky, carrying a message too powerful to ignore. The planning of the march was a monumental task. It was not simply about bringing people together. It was about channeling generations of pain into a peaceful demonstration of unity. The leaders of the movement, from the SCELF to the NAP and other organizations, worked tirelessly to ensure that this event would reflect both discipline and dignity. The date was set for August 28, 1963, and as the day approached, thousands began their journey to Washington, traveling in packed buses, trains, and cars from every corner of the country. Many carried signs demanding jobs, fair wages, and equal rights. Some carried only faith. For King, this was more than a protest, it was a moral pilgrimage. That morning, the National Mall transformed into a sea of humanity. More than 250,000 people filled the space between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial, their faces a reflection of both struggle and hope. They came not only to witness history but to be part of it. The air was thick with anticipation. Songs of freedom echoed across the crowd, and the symbols of America's promise stood in solemn witness. It was no coincidence that the stage was set at the foot of Abraham Lincoln's statue, the president who had signed the Emancipation Proclamation a century earlier. Yet 100 years after that act of liberation, true freedom had still not reached every American. As King stepped forward to speak, the crowd fell into a reverent silence. He stood tall and calm, his dark suit absorbing the sunlight, his voice steady but alive with conviction. The words he had prepared were powerful, carefully written to address the urgency of the moment, the need for civil and economic justice, the call for America to live up to its founding ideals. He spoke of police brutality, of poverty, of the long night of racial injustice that had yet to end. His speech was deliberate, his tone controlled, echoing off the marble columns with a preacher's rhythm. But what came next was something no one could have scripted. As he reached the closing portion of his address, gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, standing nearby, called out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." It was a moment of divine interruption. And King, inspired, set aside his notes. His cadence shifted. His words began to soar. "I have a dream," he said, his voice rising with each repetition, "that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, that all men are created equal." The crowd erupted in applause, but King continued, carried by something greater than rhetoric. His dream unfolded like a vision of America's soul-redeemed children of different races joining hands, justice flowing like water, freedom ringing from every hill and mountain. His voice swelled with hope and righteous urgency, weaving faith and politics into poetry. "I have a dream," he said again, "that one day my 4 little children will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character." Those words, simple yet eternal, hung in the air like a promise. For 17 minutes, King spoke not only to those before him but to the conscience of the world. Every phrase seemed to lift the crowd higher, binding them together in a collective sense of purpose. It was not just a call for civil rights. It was a call for moral awakening. He spoke of a dream rooted in the American ideal of liberty, but reborn through the moral clarity of love and nonviolence. His voice, resonant and unwavering, turned pain into prophecy, transforming decades of despair into a shared vision of hope. When he finished, there was a pause, a breath suspended in time, and then the crowd erupted into thunderous applause. Many wept openly, others clasped hands and prayed. It was more than admiration. It was recognition. The people had heard their own story spoken back to them, their suffering and endurance dignified in the language of faith and promise. News of the speech spread across the globe. Newspapers captured the moment with photographs of King standing before the Lincoln Memorial, his arm outstretched, his face lit by conviction. Television broadcasts carried his words into living rooms across America, forcing the nation to confront its conscience. For those who had doubted the movement, the March on Washington revealed its moral grandeur, a peaceful gathering of hundreds of thousands who demanded justice not through anger, but through the unyielding power of truth. King's I Have a Dream speech became more than an event. It became a turning point. It crystallized the hopes of a generation and reshaped the national conversation. In the months that followed, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 began to take shape, signaling that the government could no longer ignore the moral demand for equality. Yet King himself remained humble, knowing that the dream he spoke of was still unfinished. That day in Washington was the culmination of years of faith, struggle, and sacrifice. It was the embodiment of everything the movement had stood for since Montgomery, the belief that love could triumph over hate, that unity could dissolve fear, and that moral courage could alter the course of history. King's dream was not merely a speech. It was a mirror held up to the American soul, asking it to live up to its highest ideals. As the crowd slowly dispersed into the fading afternoon light, there was a sense that something profound had changed. The journey toward equality was far from over, but the dream had taken root in the hearts of millions. It would echo through generations, carried by the conviction that words, when spoken with truth and faith, could move a nation toward its better self. When the announcement came that Martin Luther King Jr. had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, it was more than a personal triumph. It was a moment of collective validation for millions who had marched, boycotted, prayed, and hoped alongside him. Standing in Oslo, King spoke not for himself, but for the movement, for the maids, students, ministers, and children who had risked everything to demand dignity. His words were gentle but resolute. I accept this award on behalf of a movement which is moving with determination and a majestic scorn for risk and danger. The world listened, and for a brief moment, it seemed that the conscience of humanity had been stirred awake. But even as the applause echoed across continents, King's vision began to evolve. He understood that the struggle for civil rights in America could not be separated from the broader fight against poverty and injustice everywhere. He saw that true equality was not merely about sitting at the same lunch counter or attending the same schools. It was about economic opportunity, decent housing, fair wages, and access to the fullness of life. The fight for civil rights had illuminated one dimension of injustice, but King now sought to expose the deeper roots, the economic and moral systems that allowed inequality to persist across nations. He began to speak of the triple evils: racism, poverty, and war as intertwined forces that degraded both the oppressed and the oppressor. To him, peace without justice was hollow, and prosperity built upon exploitation was nothing more than gilded cruelty. King traveled to the slums of Chicago, where families endured winters without heat, and to rural Mississippi, where children still lived in hunger. He stood not as an outsider preaching moral ideals, but as a man determined to face the painful truths of his own country. In these forgotten places, he found both despair and resilience. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. he reminded America, tied in a single garment of destiny. His stance on the Vietnam War brought him both admiration and criticism. Many of his allies, even within the civil rights movement, urged him to remain silent. They feared his opposition to the war would alienate political supporters or be seen as unpatriotic. But King could not remain quiet. He saw young black men being sent to fight and die abroad for freedoms they were denied at home. He saw billions spent on bombs while poor children in American cities went hungry. In his powerful sermon Beyond Vietnam, he declared that his conscience left him no choice but to speak. He called the war a moral disaster and urged America to become a force for peace, not domination. That speech, perhaps more than any other, revealed King's true moral courage. He was no longer simply the preacher who dreamed of equality. He had become a prophet challenging the soul of a nation. The backlash was swift. Newspapers that once praised him now condemned him. Political leaders distanced themselves. Donations to his organizations dwindled. But King endured, guided not by popularity but by principle. Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? He once said. Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? Despite the growing pressure, King continued to act. He launched the Poor People's Campaign, a movement designed to unite Americans across racial and regional lines to demand fair wages, jobs, and housing. He envisioned caravans of the poor traveling to Washington. See, not in anger but in moral determination, to confront the nation with the truth of its inequality. His speeches became less about dreams and more about duty, a call to rebuild the moral foundation of society. Through it all, King's faith remained unshaken. He still believed in the power of love. Even in a world that often answered love with hatred, he still believed that humanity, despite its flaws, could rise above greed and fear. Those close to him noticed a deepened gravity in his voice, a quiet, knowing that his life's mission was nearing its end. Yet there was also serenity, as if he had made peace with the path he had chosen. When he received the Nobel Peace Prize, King had said he accepted it with faith in the future of humankind. 4 years later, that faith had been tested by violence, division, and betrayal. Yet he never surrendered it. His expanding mission from civil rights to human rights revealed a truth that transcends time. The justice cannot exist in isolation, and peace without equality is an illusion. As the movement grew weary and the nation grew restless, King's vision stretched beyond the horizon of his own life. He no longer spoke just of freedom for a people, but redemption for a world. His legacy, crystallized in those final years, was not only a dream, it was a call to action. A reminder that moral courage begins when comfort ends, and that the fight for justice, in every, belongs to all who dare to believe in the better angels of our nature. By the spring of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was a man burdened with both vision and weariness. Years of marches, threats, and heartbreak had etched lines of fatigue into his face. Yet his eyes still carried the quiet fire of conviction. He had come to Memphis, Tennessee, not for a grand rally or a speech beneath the marble steps of the Capitol, but to stand with a group of men who collected the city's trash, the sanitation workers, black men underpaid, overworked, and treated as if their lives were disposable, had gone on strike after 2 of their fellow workers were crushed to death in a garbage truck. Their simple demand was dignity, the right to be seen as human. King saw in their struggle the same moral battle that had defined his entire life, a demand for justice rooted in respect for every soul. The city of Memphis was tense, the air heavy with resentment and fear. Yet when King arrived, he did what he had always done. He listened. He met with workers, pastors, and community leaders, hearing stories of exhaustion and humiliation. Many had labored for decades without ever earning enough to feed their families properly. Their placards bore 4 simple words, "I am a." That declaration resonated deeply with King. To him, it was not just a labor slogan. It was a cry for recognition from those long ignored by society. He told them their cause was righteous, that their fight was not only for better wages, but for the soul of America. On April 3, 1968, despite exhaustion and threats to his life, King stood before a crowded church and delivered what would be his final speech. The night was stormy, thunder echoing outside as if nature itself mirrored the turmoil within the nation. His voice, though weary, carried the weight of prophecy. He spoke of the long road toward justice, of the dangers that lay ahead, and of the moral necessity to keep moving forward. "I have been to the mountaintop," he said, "and I have looked over. I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but we, as a people, will get to the promised land." The audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause, not knowing that those words would soon echo through grief. The following evening, as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, King stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. He was in good spirits, preparing for a community dinner with friends. In a moment that would alter history, a single shot rang out. It was sudden, piercing, final. The world seemed to hold its breath as the man who had preached love over hate, peace over violence, collapsed. His companions rushed to his side, their cries echoing through the courtyard. Within an hour, the news swept across the nation. Martin Luther King Jr. was gone. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Cities across America erupted, some in mourning, others in anger. Crowds filled the streets. Candles flickered beside portraits of King, and grief turned to unrest as decades of pain boiled over. For many, his death felt like the silencing of hope itself. Yet amid the sorrow, something profound began to stir. In churches, homes, and city halls, voices rose not in despair, but in determination. His followers vowed that his mission would not die with him. If he had lived, one mourner said, he would still be fighting. Now we must fight for him. Across the nation, leaders and citizens reflected on his message and his sacrifice. His death forced America to confront the unfinished work of justice. Congress soon passed the Fair Housing Act, one of the final major victories of the civil rights movement, a legislative recognition of the dream he had pursued until his last breath. But beyond laws and policies, King's passing ignited something deeper, a renewed moral reckoning. His nonviolent philosophy, once criticized as too passive, now stood as a timeless standard for conscience-led action. Even those who had opposed him were moved to reconsider the meaning of courage, compassion, and equality. In Memphis, the sanitation workers eventually won their demands, not because the world suddenly became fair, but because King had shown a light too bright to ignore. His final campaign became a symbol that the fight for justice was not limited to marches or speeches. It was in the dignity of work, in the right to be seen and heard. That lesson extended far beyond the streets of Memphis. It reached into schools where children learned to see one another as equals, into workplaces where fairness became a moral expectation, and into the hearts of those who still believed that love could overcome division. As time passed, King's assassination came to represent both an ending and a beginning. His death marked the close of an era defined by struggle and courage. Yet it also opened a new chapter of reflection and responsibility. People began to ask not only what King had accomplished, but what they themselves must do to continue his mission. His voice, though silenced, still echoed in the conscience of a nation. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, he had once said. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Decades later, his legacy remains alive, not confined to history books, but carried in every act of justice, compassion, and truth. The balcony of the Lorraine Motel stands preserved today, transformed into the National Civil Rights Museum, a place where visitors come not merely to remember his death, but to renew their understanding of his life. There, beneath the quiet sky of Memphis, people stand before the spot where King fell and feel the weight of his final lesson, that the pursuit of justice demands sacrifice, that peace requires courage, and that even in death, a dream can live on. Martin Luther King Jr. did not live to see the promised land he spoke of, but his vision continues to guide generations toward it. His life was proof that moral strength can outlast bullets, and his death was a reminder that the struggle for equality is not the burden of the few, but the calling of all. In the end, the man who once stood on the mountaintop left behind not just a dream, but a direction, a path for humanity to follow toward the light he never stopped believing in. Decades have passed since that fateful night in Memphis, yet the voice of Martin Luther King Jr. continues to echo across generations, across nations, and across the conscience of humanity. His dream did not fade with time. It transformed into a living legacy, one that breathes in classrooms where young students learn about equality, in city halls where leaders draft laws to protect human rights, and in every peaceful march that rises against injustice anywhere in the world. King's vision was never just about America. It was about the human spirit, about the moral duty of people everywhere to rise above hatred, fear, and indifference. In the years following his death, the impact of his work reshaped not only the United States but also the moral fabric of global society. The Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, which had already changed the legal structure of America, gained deeper meaning through his sacrifice. But King's legacy reached far beyond legislation. His message became a language of liberation for countless movements worldwide, from South Africa, struggle against apartheid, to the push for democracy in Eastern Europe. From the campaigns for workers' rights in Latin America to the calls for peace and environmental justice in modern times. Wherever people have stood up and said, "This is wrong," his spirit has walked beside them. King's moral philosophy endures because it speaks to something universal, the belief that humanity's true power lies not in force, but in compassion. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, he once declared, a sentence that today resonates louder than ever, in an era still plagued by inequality, division, and conflict. Those words remind us that the boundaries between our struggles are illusions. When one person is denied dignity, the whole world is diminished. And when people act together with courage, empathy, and love, the world bends, slowly but surely, toward justice. The image of King standing before a sea of faces in Washington, sea declaring his dream under the open sky, has become one of history's eternal symbols. Yet the deeper truth is that his dream was not a destination but a direction, a constant call to act, to serve, to care. He believed that moral progress required not only laws and speeches but also personal responsibility. Every act of kindness, every stand against discrimination, every effort to lift another soul out of despair is part of that dream. And in this sense, the story of Martin Luther King Jr. is not just a historical narrative. It is an ongoing challenge to each of us to live with purpose. Today, his influence can be felt in new generations of activists, young people using technology, art, and social movements to confront modern injustices. Whether they speak for racial equality, gender rights, environmental protection, or peace, their voices carry the same conviction that once guided King through marches and jails. His belief that moral courage can change history has inspired movements from Black Lives Matter to campaigns for freedom in Myanmar and beyond. The torch he lit continues to pass from hand to hand, heart to heart, never extinguished, always evolving, And yet, King's message was never one of simple optimism. He understood that the path toward justice would always demand sacrifice. He warned that silence in the face of wrong was complicity, and that love without action was not enough. His dream remains powerful not because it promised ease, but because it dared humanity to rise above its nature, to love where it is easier to hate, to forgive where it is easier to condemn, and to keep moving forward even when progress feels impossible. That moral courage is what makes his life not just inspirational, but transformative. As we look around the world today, his words still hold the power to awaken conscience. When communities stand together against oppression, when nations seek peace instead of war, when individuals choose empathy over apathy, in those moments, the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. lives on. His legacy reminds us that the struggle for justice is not a relic of the past, but a living promise, one that each generation must renew. And so, as we close this story, we remember not only the man, but the movement he inspired. Martin Luther King Jr. taught us that greatness is not measured by power, but by service, that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice, and that love, active, courageous, unyielding love, remains the most revolutionary force on earth. His life was a call to action, and his death a testament to the cost of moral truth. But his dream endures not as an ideal locked in history, but as a living flame, burning wherever people refuse to accept the world as it is and dare to imagine what it can become. Thank you for listening to this journey through the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His dream belongs to all of us, a reminder that hope is strongest when shared, and justice is closest when we stand together. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the power each of us holds to make a difference, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others who believe in building a better, fairer world. Together, we can keep the dream alive, not just in memory, but in action, every single day.